In this session, the aim is to see how individual letters were formed and how they differ in appearance from the type of handwriting we might expect to see in more modern times. We shall also see not only that different scribes or clerks had their own distinctive handwriting styles, but also that inconsistencies crop up within the work of individual clerks. In this session, the aim is to see how individual letters were formed and how they differ in appearance from their counterparts in the types of handwriting we might expect to see in more modern times. We shall also see not only that different scribes or clerks had their own distinctive handwriting styles, but also that inconsistencies crop up within the work of individual clerks, since they would often find two or more distinct ways to write particular letters of the alphabet. You might well find it helpful to have some writing materials and a magnifying glass to hand, and, if you'd like to hear my commentary, speakers or headphones ought to prove useful. Handwriting has evolved over time. As the Conisbrough court rolls span hundreds of years, many clerks have contributed to its pages. Even with so many hands involved, though, there are clear stylistic trends at work, influencing the handwriting of every generation. It's remarkable how uniformly and seemingly simultaneously the professional writing classes adopted the latest styles of script. No doubt they followed the guidance of their teachers to begin with, at least, but would they have stuck throughout their careers with the style they'd been taught at the outset, or would they have taken up different fashions as tastes changed? This isn't a question that has a ready answer. Take a look at the 5 samples of handwriting taken from different time periods from the Conisbrough court rolls. Pause the video and look carefully at the handwriting. Can you see any stylistic features that would help you match the handwriting sample to the timeline below? Looking at the handwriting samples, did you manage to pick out some of the stylistic features from the different periods? How many were you able to match to the correct date? Yet another different style is seen in this slide, which shows an extract from almost 50 years later than the latest example in the previous slide. This is a sample of the type of handwriting we are going to focus on. It's an ideal place to start learning some of the key skills associated with paleography, since earlier entries present at least one extra layer of difficulty by being written in Latin. Putting pen to paper is a complicated task that has many influences, each one helping to make our handwriting unique to us. At a basic level, there are physical influences. Your brain must visualise the letters you want to write. You need fine motor skills to be able to grip and move a pen to form letters. You have to have spatial awareness to be able to space letters and words appropriately. More subtly, there are social influences. There are trends that can affect handwriting as different stylistic traits can become more fashionable and so more common at different periods of time. Then again, other people's handwriting can be an influence. The handwriting not just of teachers, who are clearly crucial to all this, but of those close to an individual such as parents, siblings and friends can become a model of what handwriting should look like. And particular to a given time and place, there are environmental influences. The writing implements and paper available, the writing surface, the temperature of the room, time constraints and the overall mood of an individual, all these can play a part. When you put all those factors together, it's no surprise that each person's handwriting turns out differently from others. The handwriting examples above are all provided by 25 to 30-year-olds. They have a broad similarity to each other, but nevertheless, each handwriting example is unique. Overall, the handwriting types that we see in the Conisbrough court rolls have a kinship, a similarity. Since none of them could be called anachronistic, they are very much of their time and exhibit many features in common. Having said this, though, it is clear enough that external factors of the sort described in the previous slide have had an effect on the handwriting of the clerks employed on the rolls during the 1650s, to the extent that the hands of several different writers can be distinguished without much difficulty. Looking at this page from the Conisbrough court rolls, it's clear to see that it's been written by more than one person. Experts in the field have identified 12 characteristics of handwriting that can be used to help determine whether particular pieces of writing are the work of the same person. These characteristics were intended to help analyse modern handwriting, but they're every bit as useful when you're looking at the written word from several centuries ago. Starting with line quality. Do the lines flow, or are they shaky and irregular? This can have something to do with the speed of the writing. Word and letter spacing. Are the letters and words equally spaced out, or are they bunched together? Or is there seemingly no pattern to the spacing? Size consistency. Is the ratio of height to width consistent in each letter? Pen lifts. Does the writer lift the pen from the paper, or is the writing continuous? Connecting strokes. Are uppercase and lowercase letters connected and continuous? Letter formation. Are the letters fully formed, or are parts missing? Do the letters look the same? Cursive and printed letters. Are the letters cursive, printed, or a combination of both? Pen pressure. Is the pen pressure equal for upward and downward strokes? When is the pressure applied? Slant. Do the letters slant to the left or the right, or does this vary? Baseline habits. Is the writing on the baseline of the paper, above the line, or below the line? Flourishes and embellishments. Are there any fancy curls, loops, or anything else unusual in the writing? Crossbars and tittles. Where are the crosses on T's and dots on I's and J's? Are the T's crossed? Is the cross on the T at the top, middle, or bottom of the letter? Are the I's dotted? If so, are they dotted to the left, the centre, or the right of the I? Pause this video here. Using the 12 characteristics, can you tell how many people were involved writing this page of the Conisbrough Court Rolls? There appear to be 5 changeovers from one writer to another on this page, and, at a stretch, one could make a case for saying that as many as 5 people were involved in producing this passage. The handwriting and spacing of the first 4 lines, outlined in blue, gives this opening section a very clear appearance. Although written in a cursive hand, the letters and words are not squeezed together and so are easy to tell apart. In this paragraph, the letter formations sit on the baseline vertically with no slant. The crossbars to letters are positioned in the middle of the letter, and the tittles above the I's are central. The flourishes are also fairly minimal compared to the other sections of this page. We can see straight away that the paragraphs highlighted in red have a clear difference from the section in blue. It's that the writing has a slant. You can see the letters are angled to the right. On closer inspection, we can see that the letters are also closer together and smaller in size than those in the blue section. The lines are closer together too, and so the ascending and descending parts of letters often become entangled and more awkward to read as a result. The paragraph highlighted in yellow also has writing that slants slightly to the right. However, here the spacing between the lines is more generous, making it much easier to read. The ink is also lighter than the ink in the red paragraph, indicating that the pen pressure may be different. In the green highlighted section, although only a few lines, the writing here looks different again from the handwriting we've already looked at. It seems a little more upright, and the letter H has an extra flourish that goes into the descending space which is not found elsewhere on the page. The purple highlighted passage looks to be written by yet another individual. There's no slant to the writing, and it has a resemblance to that in the passage highlighted in blue. However, comparing the formation of the letter E in the 2 sections, you can see a difference. In the blue highlighted passage, the letter E looks like a modern E written backwards, whereas in the purple section, the E's appear to be made up of a short, slightly curved upright stroke capped with a more distinctly hooked horizontal stroke. Could this page really have been written by 5 different people? Even if not as many as that, it remains unclear why several clerks were needed to record the proceedings on this page, and why it was necessary for them to take over from each other in mid-sentence on at least 2 occasions. We're fortunate in having 2 versions of the court record for the 1650s, a draft version and a fair copy. The clerk would produce his first record of the business of the court while the court was in session. Because the court's business would be conducted at a fairly fast pace, the entries would often be messy, made in haste, with omissions, insertions and crossings out. To ensure that there would be a readable record of the session, a fair copy would later be written up from the draft. Although the 17th century Conisbrough Court rolls are written in English, the style of handwriting used is not one that's entirely familiar to the modern reader. In fact, at first glance the rolls can appear quite daunting. However, learning the basics of the ways in which the letters of the alphabet were formed can make the process a little easier. Some of the letters are close to the way that we still write them today, and some of them will look very different. What follows sets out to assist in recognising individual letters, as written by a small group of clerks in a Yorkshire lordship in the mid-17th century. This might seem a little restricted in its ambition, but the fact is that understanding the way in which letters were formed at that time and in that place will make it easier to read not just the Conisbrough Court rolls of the period we're focusing on, but many another document besides, from other parts of the country and from 75 or more years either side of the 1650s. We'll take a minute now to go through some of the vocabulary that will be used during the session. Uppercase is a term used to signify the capital letters of the alphabet, whereas lowercase indicates the small letters of the alphabet. A minim is a term for a short vertical stroke found in the letters M, N and U, and also, unexpectedly perhaps, for V at this period. The crossbar is the horizontal stroke through a letter, as in T and F. A tittle is the small dot found above the letters I and J. And spacing, not surprisingly, is the distance between letters, words and sentences, and between lines. We can now have a look at the words most often encountered in describing how handwriting is organised. The most familiar, perhaps, is margin, the margin being the space on the left-hand side of the page. It isn't always an empty space. You'll find it used in the Conisbrough rolls for inserting captions, notes, dates and fines. The baseline. The baseline is simply the line on which the letter sits. The X-height, that marks the top of the space occupied by letters such as A, C and, not surprisingly, X. These sit on the baseline and don't ascend or descend above or below this space. Ascender space. The ascender space is the space above the X-height of a letter. Taller letters such as H and L intrude into this. The descender space is the space below the baseline. The tails of letters such as G and Y drop into this space. Today, when children are taught handwriting at school, they have the benefit of paper with printed lines to help them size and space their letters and to keep the lines of text from colliding. Pre-lined paper was not a luxury available in the 17th century, but clerks would often prepare the parchment or paper for themselves in order to keep the writing straight across the page. They would take a knife and a ruler and score lines across the page so that there was a faint mark to guide their hand while writing and ensure that the lines were separate and distinct. You can sometimes see these faint lines on the Conisbrough Court rolls if you look carefully. Taking a thematic approach to the letters of the alphabet, rather than an alphabetical one, we're going to divide them up into ascenders, X-height letters and descenders, and look at these 3 groups in turn. Ascenders are letters that sit on the baseline and go into the ascender space above the X-height of letters. All modern capital letters are ascenders, as are the lowercase letters B, D, F, H, K, L and T. Let's take a look at these letters from the mid-17th century entries in the Conisbrough Court rolls. Beginning with the letter B, we find that in its 17th century form, It's usually fairly easy to identify as it tends to look very similar to its modern counterpart. The capital B can be seen here highlighted in green. Lowercase b's can be seen highlighted in blue, along with one interloper that isn't a B. The base of the B on the lowest line is a little different to that of the other examples. It's slightly flattened. On the top line, we can see the date 1652 in Arabic numerals. The 6 bears a striking resemblance to lowercase b. In the Conisbrough Court rolls at this period, dates are very often written in Arabic numerals. Sums of money, on the other hand, would generally be written out in full, or, particularly in the margins, using Roman numerals. The 17th century letter D is also easy to spot, as it's very similar to the D in modern handwriting. However, the difference between the capital and lowercase d's is fairly subtle. Capital D's can be seen here highlighted in green, as in George Drabble and Domain. Here they drop a little into the descender space. Lowercase d's can be seen highlighted in blue, in Richard, the surnames Wild, Whitehead and Wood, and Seized and And. They mostly sit neatly on the baseline, but are sometimes perched a little above it. This is particularly true of the D of Wood on the third bottom line, which seems to have been very hastily written. Also very similar to its modern counterpart is the letter F. Today's Fs, and especially capitals, sometimes rest on the baseline. The examples here occupy ascending and descending space. Capital F, highlighted in green, is written in a way that looks like two small f's put together. The letter H, in contrast, can take on a variety of forms throughout the 17th century entries to the Conisbrough Court rolls. Some forms of the letter H are easy to identify and look very much like the modern form, whereas others, particularly those that descend below the line, look nothing like their present-day equivalents. Looking at the example on the left, you'd be forgiven for failing to identify this word as which. It features two different versions of the letter H. The first H is recognisably modern in style. The H at the end of the word is more outlandish, looking more like a modern letter P. In fact, it's rather similar to the P's in the pertinences in the extract on the right-hand side, except for the fact that the loops of these P's rest on the baseline, whilst the H is lifted a little way into the ascender space. The right-hand extract also features two examples of yet another H variant, a low slung type, outlined in blue in the middle of the extract, and two more modern-looking ones. The letter K is found distributed sporadically through the Conisbrough Court rolls. The K at the end of Blackburn, in the example on the left-hand side, is the more typical, with its raised leading leg making it resemble a modern T. The letter K at the end of Sheepshank, highlighted on the right-hand side, is more obvious, even though the leading leg extends dramatically into the descender space. In this example, featuring the letter L, it's at first glance hard to see the capital L of Lord. The lack of space in between the words Lord and for makes it harder to distinguish the word Lord in the first place, whilst the sheer size of the L means it intrudes into the lines above and below, and the flourish from the word immediately above serves to confuse things further. Here you can see the L highlighted in yellow. Lowercase l's are a good deal easier to spot, as they do tend to look like the modern L. Initial L in this extract tends to have a flattish base from which the letter ascends. When L is in the middle of words, though, this flatter base is absent. With the letter T, the capitals tend to be more elaborate than anything we would normally use today. They generally feature a curved stem and a crossbar with an extravagant flourish that can be placed at various jaunty angles. Lowercase t, on the other hand, is almost identical to what we see today, although it's less likely to have a curved base than the modern T's, and the height of the crossbar can vary depending on the letters that the T is joined to. Earlier writers would often have had the T at X height, making it look very much like a C. By the mid-17th century, though, a tall T was more in favour, often showing a minimalist approach to the crossbar that could leave it virtually non-existent. Turning now to X-height letters, you'll recall that in modern handwriting these are the letters that sit on the baseline and don't ascend. X-height letters tend to be much the same now as they were in the past. There are some exceptions though. There isn't a great deal to be said about the letter A, certainly in this example, both upper and lowercase. This entry has apparently been written by two different clerks. The point where the changeover occurs isn't altogether difficult to spot. C's, especially capital C's, come in a range of forms throughout the Conisbrough record. Some lowercase c's could pass for a small letter R or a T, whereas some capital C's have a lot in common with their modern-day counterpart, as for example the second clerk's C for court, which differs from a modern style only in the fact that it descends well below the line. Others, such as the C of custom in the last line written by clerk number 1, look markedly different. At this period, the capital C can also take on this 3/4 of a circle with a cross through it appearance. 3/4 of a hot cross bun, if you like, for want of a more technical expression. It's well known that the letter E is the most used letter in the English language. It's perhaps less commonly known that E was even more extensively used 400 years ago. As you can see here, there's an extra E at the end of the words custom, street, and between, and an unexpected E in adjoining, evidently spellings favoured by this particular clerk. Spelling was somewhat fluid at this time and was a matter of personal choice to a large extent, often influenced by the preferences of one's teacher. At a much earlier time, an E at the end of a noun or adjective could have a grammatical significance and would have been sounded as an additional syllable when spoken. This grammatical aspect had ceased to apply long before the 17th century, though. But E's that we would consider surplus to requirements remained. These E's had largely been tidied away before the 19th century, although they ended up having a sort of afterlife. E at the end of words was remembered as the hallmark of old spellings, and it came to be seen, along with ye, of which more later, as one of the most effective ways of creating cod oldie-worldy English, for comic effect, or to declare the antiquity, real or spurious, of pubs, such as Ye Olde Castle Hotel in Doncaster, and other commercial premises in tourist destinations, such as the Oldie Tea Shoppy. The letter E is fairly easy to spot in this passage, but it does show quite a bit of variation. Where the E lies in the word can influence the way it's formed, it seems. At its simplest, here, there is the stretched O shape with a line across it. At its most elaborate, it starts to look like a stretched spring, sometimes incorporating an unintended ink blob. Continuing with the same clerk's work, we see here some slightly more restrained lowercase e's, along with two varieties of uppercase E. The E of Edmund looks a bit like a backwards 3. The E of Edward looks like a capital C with a faint stroke through the middle. With this clerk, the small e he generally uses differs only slightly from his C, as for example with the C of acre at the start of the last complete line. Some of his E's, though, look more like those seen in the previous slide. The style of the letter E used is one clue to the changeover between two clerks, seen in this extract. The line where the change occurred is above the red dotted line. The precise point seems to be between builded and situate, judging from the type of E favoured. Of course, the shift from leaning letters to more upright ones does help too. A minim is a short X-height vertical stroke used in handwriting. They would be used at this period to form the letters I, J, M, N, U and V. Lowercase u and v could be identical, made up of two minims joined by a single connecting stroke or ligature. A row of minims can be tricky to interpret. There's often little option but to count them and work out which of these letters will fit. Nowadays the connecting strokes usually help us to tell whether, for example, an N or a U is intended. This is not always true of 17th century and earlier handwriting. The word administrators, shown above, includes a row of 7 minims. Fortunately, the I is not only dotted, it's dotted accurately over the letter, and this is a great help in working out which other letters are there. Near the end of the same line is a shorter word with 3 minims. Is it five or fine? The 17th century letters I and J can very often be difficult to tell apart. Lowercase I is often used instead of lowercase j, as we can see here in the word adjoining. 3 identical I's are highlighted in blue here, but the first of the 3 is clearly doing the work of a J. Capital I and J tend to look very similar as well. The J of James is highlighted to the right in green. The I of the surname Ingle is highlighted in orange. Turning to the capital letter M, the 2 examples we can see here are both similar to modern equivalents. They are rather more embellished though, especially the capital M of May. As mentioned earlier, the letter N can often be difficult to distinguish from U, especially in a cursive hand. The 2 letters can appear virtually identical, since both can be written as 2 minims linked at either top or bottom, or by a diagonal stroke from the bottom of one minim to the top of the other. The N of AND in the image above is one instance. In the other image, the clerk has taken more care, and the lowercase n is easy to identify. Its capital N is strikingly embellished, though, and the modern reader might think it more like a capital H than an N. Lowercase r appears in 2 distinct variants in this piece. The double R of arable and the single R in or and park could almost pass for U, whereas the R of pasture and farum looks more like its equivalent in a certain style of modern handwriting. Is there a rule as to which R is used? Perhaps type 2 was normally used when the letter followed a minim. Incidentally, returning to the topic we looked at 2 slides ago, the minims of the double N of manor and the M of farum are linked at the bottom. The type of capital R seen here on rude is typical of the period. You'll note that it has no front leg, something that perhaps makes it look more like a modern capital P. In this extract you can see that the lowercase r is pretty consistent, with only one variety of the letter in use. The capitals, in contrast, do show some slight variation. In fact, all are just a little different from each other. R for Robert has a strong base, which the R of rude lacks, whilst the R for Rotherham features 2 uprights. The lowercase letters F, shown here in blue, and S, shown in yellow, were generally written in a very similar fashion, as they both descended below the baseline and move into the ascender space. You'd be forgiven if you were to mix the 2 up when reading the document today. There are 2 ways to tell these 2 letters apart. 1. Look for the crossbar. The letter F will have a horizontal crossbar through the stalk of the letter. 2. The context. Would the word make more sense if it had a letter S or F? The word here is aforesaid. The long S didn't last much beyond 1800 in printed works, and its handwritten version died out soon after. This isn't quite all there is to be said as far as the letter S is concerned, though. There are 2 distinct variants of the lowercase letter S throughout the Conisbrough Court rolls, and not just in the mid-17th century. There is, as we've already seen, the lowercase s that's long and looks a bit like the letter F, highlighted here in blue. In addition, there's the lowercase letter s that's almost always used if S is at the end of the word. This is very much more like the S that we would use today, and here we see it highlighted in yellow. Capital S's are quite regularly stylised using a pair of lines scored vertically through the top, in this instance, in a similar way to the treatment of the capitals G and O we looked at previously. These are highlighted in green. The scores can sometimes go through the whole of the letter from top to bottom, leaving the S looking like a dollar symbol. When there's a double S in a word, it's usual for there to be one long S and one short S. We see an example highlighted in purple in the word premises. Lowercase w usually looks much like the one we tend to use today. You can see examples highlighted in green here. Whereas the uppercase w, though often quite straightforward, can also be written with rather more in the way of elaboration. This is particularly true of the examples in the upper image. Examples of the letter X are fairly plentiful in the text. There are 3 in this extract, and it is, of course, regularly encountered where sums of money are expressed in Roman numerals. Lowercase letters X and P often have a superficial similarity. This is reinforced by the fact that X generally looks more like a modern P than a modern X. Seen together, though, the difference is fairly obvious. The X, highlighted in blue, has a dramatically curved tail, whereas that of the P heads off to 7:30 in a dead straight line before returning a little more faintly to link up with the H that follows it. This Z, with its long tail, looks different to the X-height Z in general use today. However, it does look very much like the sort of Z that was commonly taught in school until the mid-20th century. Though not seen all that often these days, tailed Zs are far from extinct. Descenders are letters that sit on the baseline and go into the space below the baseline. In modern handwriting, the only descenders are the letters G, J, P, Q and Y. All modern capital letters are ascenders, of course, even those whose lowercase versions are descenders. What form then did these letters take when written in the 17th century Manor Court records from Conisbrough? There aren't many variant forms of the lowercase g. The top of the letter can be rounded or deliberately squared off. The tail can loop to the left or the right. Even so, they remain very much like the small g's we would expect to see today. A few examples have been highlighted in blue in the above extracts. We saw one variety of capital G earlier on, and can see it again in the upper extract. The example shown in the lower extract is rather different, less ornate, and with a shortish tail dropping below the baseline. As we've seen, the lowercase letter J is seldom seen in the Conisbrough Court rolls, owing to the fact that it's often replaced with a lowercase letter I. However, capital J's are not infrequently encountered, mostly at the beginning of personal names and the names of months, as with June in the left-hand extract, for example. The capital P in this passage is readily recognised and has a consistent appearance. It also has a tail that descends well below the line. The lowercase p, seen in the name Ralph, has a longer tail, long enough in fact to reach the line below. It's also set at a more pronounced angle than the general slant of this clerk's handwriting. The P's of pays and pence we see here are much the same as the small p of the previous slide. Could this suggest that this is the work of the same clerk? Not writing a fair copy this time, but writing in his speedier, more cursive style. Examples of the letter Q aren't all that easy to come by. There's a lowercase q here in Esquire on the top line, and you'll see that it could be mistaken for a letter G. Capital Q's are even harder to find. In fact, I was unable to find a single example from the mid-17th century Conisbrough rolls. Nevertheless, I would expect any that do turn up to be identified readily enough from the context. Y was often used where we would normally use the letter I, as for example with died, D-Y-E-D, in the middle of the second complete line in the above extract. This of course means departed this life and has nothing to do with the process of colouring textiles. Because it has a long tail, the Y can often get tangled with words below. As we can see here, the Y of by, fourth line from the bottom, has made a bit of a mess of the word as on the line below. This Y has a plain tail, as does the Y of fealty on the lowest line. The other examples, in years, died and say, have looped tails. Finally, we introduce a letter that has effectively vanished from normal English usage. It's the old Anglo-Saxon letter Thorn, used to indicate sounds that we nowadays represent with a digraph, or pair of letters. This digraph is th, used of course for the sounds that occur at the start of thin and that, for example. Thorn was commonly in use for these sounds as late as the 18th century, even if it wasn't always acknowledged as a separate letter by that stage. Latterly, though, it was seldom used for any words other than the. The letter survives these days only in Icelandic. Unusually, It occupies space below the baseline and above the X height. It takes the form of a P with an ascender or a B with a descender, depending on one's point of view. When written, it often closely resembled the letter Y. By the 15th century, it was starting slowly to drop out of fashion, as use of the letters TH to represent th started to become more popular. It survived into the age of printing, though, but started to lose its identity in the process. Imported founts of type included no thorns, and when typesetters came to set handwriting in black letter or Gothic type, they used Y in place of Thorn, simply because in that typeface it was so similar in appearance to the handwritten Thorn that they were familiar with. Of course, it was never pronounced as Y. The and that and so on remained as they'd always been. But once it had stopped being a familiar feature of written language, understanding of its purpose was lost too. Ultimately, this has led to the pseudo-medieval usage ye olde, with what would have been a Thorn pronounced as a Y, used much like the oldie-worldy E on the end of words to draw attention to the supposed antiquity of some shop or pub or other, or just for humorous effect. The clerk whose work the above extract is has a marked preference for the Thorn over TH. He uses it at the beginning, in the middle and at the end of words, which is not all that usual as late as the mid-17th century. 3, further and doth illustrate this. His rarely used TH, incidentally, can be seen in oaths towards the end of the third line. We've already looked at the examples of the letter Y in this section in the previous slide, and we can see here that they are distinctly different from Thorn. This clerk's Thorn has more in common with his letter P, in fact, particularly in the style of tail. Have a look at this piece of text. Can you find all the examples of the letter E? Pause the video to give yourself more time to look and then press play to find out the answer. How many letter E's did you find? In this section of text, by my reckoning, there are 22 lowercase e's and 2 uppercase, though it's always possible I've missed the odd one. Now see if you can find all the examples of the letter R in this piece of text. Pause the video to give yourself more time to look and then press play to find out the answer. How many examples of the letter R have you found? This letter's a slightly unhelpful shape sometimes and can be much harder to spot. In this section of text, I think there are 20 examples of the lowercase letter R. Well done. We've now come to the end of session 2 of Paleography of the Conisbrough Court Rolls, in which we've focused on the 17th century alphabet. What we've done in today's session is, I hope, gained an understanding that handwriting is era-specific, and that, as a byproduct, we can have a reasonable stab at dating documents based on the handwriting style used. We've found that 350 years ago, handwriting was unique to an individual, just as it is today. And we've familiarised ourselves with some typical letter forms from the 17th century.